Welcome back to Whose Spine Is It Anyways, where the pineal gland is aimed up and the joints don't matter. I'm your host, the element freak himself, and boy, if my throat isn't sore by the time we're done, my back will be. We are going to dissect this curse of geology, but by curse of geography, I am constantly beset by train hordes because my town is bisected by a fucking railroad track. And for the life of me, I cannot find an hour of day where I can get a clean record in without those fucking horns. Thankfully, my prior recording will eliminate that issue for the majority of this video, and we will jump into the annotations to finish out Spinal Catastrophism today. But first, some bookkeeping. Timestamps for those of little patience, but please do listen. First off, thank you all again for the massive support on part 1. I had no idea that it would become my most popular video ever, and it's been fascinating to engage with. I doubled my subscriber count because of it. In fact, you loved it so much that Spinal Catastrophism sold out completely online. This caught the attention of Urbanomic, who shortly after published a second edition of the book to meet your demands. That's awesome in its own, but I was surprised to get a DM from their Instagram account, and even more surprised when they sent me a package in the mail. Inside was a cool Spinal Catastrophism graphic tee, Urbanomic stickers, copies of Chronosis and Applied Ballardianism, and coolest of all, one of the original illustrations for Spinal Catastrophism featuring the Saurian sacral brain, sketched and signed by Thomas Moynihan himself. How did you know that this was my favorite one? I cannot thank them enough for their kindness in sending me this and for being supportive of this work. It very easily could have been the case that they did not want this kind of video made, but through their love of academia, they allowed it to persist anyways. Thank you, Thomas. I have this framed in my living room next to a Minecraft torch. To my viewers, be sure to support the official release and pick up the second edition of Spinal Catastrophism, or any number of the wild and weird works by Urbanomic and similarly talented authors. However, despite their generosity, this video is not sponsored by Urbanomic, or even Trophy Bone Artistry, who probably have no idea that I ever made that first video. I want to tell you about my game company, Diceratops Games, and our upcoming Kickstarter for Manamania. Although it is unrelated to anything discussed here, Manamania is a 2-4 set collection game where players take the role of elemental spirits. Scatter on the ley line, find your elemental alignment, drink from the mana pool, and make some mania. If you're interested, you can preview the game now on Tabletop Simulator or in our Discord. Even if you aren't a huge tabletop gamer, contributing to this campaign at launch is the best way to support my pursuits and to validate my creative efforts. Kickstarter allows you to donate any amount without expectation of rewards, but the fundamental backer tier will net you a copy of the game, some social media swag, and the print and play, all for $18 plus shipping. Anyone who backs the project will gain access to the post-campaign pledge manager, so if you change your mind, you can increase or even retract your pledge. The success of a Kickstarter depends on the explosive first days, so please consider creating an account and following our preview page. I sincerely appreciate it. But without much further ado, let us return to our divine, spiny journey back into the sacral Saurian landscapes. Lumbar Genesis. Continuing back through the 19th century, lumbar genesis really taps into the discoveries and base theories that laid the groundwork for spinal catastrophism. We'll see discussions of schizophrenia, memory, and what constitutes the individual. L1. Posteris Praecox. Eugene Bleuler, fuck me, was an influential figure in early psychiatry who was the first to speak of depth psychology, and in 1908 coined the term schizophrenia. In his 1921 book, whose title translates as Natural History of the Soul and of Your Becoming Conscious, Mnemonist Biopsychology, he describes how schizophrenia, and the sort of mental falling apart that can be symptomatic of it, represents a sort of division into separate, parallel biopsychic units. This gives reasons to think that maybe consciousness always exists like this in a sort of connected but separate state, but schizophrenia simply allows for these separate biopsychic units to become undone. These units may exist in different sections of the neural system, but all work in tandem. Schizophrenia is described as a sort of relapse into more segmented forms of consciousness, a retrogression down the stack of minds into the central nervous system Bleuler called the phylopsyche. German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin first brought sustained attention to schizophrenia, or what he and German psychiatrist Heinrich Skeul called dementia praecox. Schizophrenics are known to exhibit unusual posture, including sometimes a lack of postural control, which makes odd postures of the spine an indicator of the disorder. An article in The Lancet of 1902 referred to this as attitudes of crouching like a beast. Page 191. Again, the malady, schizophrenia, was understood as a time sickness. Heinrich eventually taxonomized this disorder as an acute form of cerebrospinal insanity, with resulting mental states described as delusional dream flowers of the spinal nerve tree. H.P. Lovecraft, a few decades later, would note this concept and write down this idea for a short story. Page 191. Autonomic nervous system and subconscious mind do not reside in the head. Have mad physician decapitate a man, but keep him alive and subconsciously controlled. Avoid copying tale by W.C. Morrow. This tale in question is The Monster Maker, found in The Ape, the Idiot, and Other People. Old pulp fiction writer W.C. Morrow wrote his 1897 story The Monster Maker, where exactly what Lovecraft described happened, and the mad scientist in the book goes on to describe all reason and intellect as ornamental flowerings of the central root of the autonomic nervous system. Page 192. So, perhaps, not just schizoid states, but all conscious states are nothing but dream flowers sprouting from an eldritch, overgrown nerve tree. In the rest of the story, the subject becomes ape-like and violent before regressing further into a shapeless, ancient, horrific blob. We see here an instance of biology reverting backwards in time based on the conditions of the psychological state of the individual. The brain is seen as a sort of memory stop, reason acting as civilized amnesia to prevent total evolutionary recall that brings a fully functioning human being backwards to collapse into the apathetic pre-life slur that ends up at the end of the story. Memory was really the topic of discussion for the 19th century, involved of all fields of psychic thought. Even the laws of physics were rationalized in some cases as a tendency for matter to remember and assume consistent patterns of behavior. The subject of memory is what we're going to move forward with in this examination, but memory is in itself a very key part of recapitulation. After all, each successive form of matter in existence is remembering what came before and passing through it in its way to become the most mature form of itself. L2. Engraphy and ecphory. No brain required. Moynihan gets into a discussion here of organic memory and mnemic psychology. Before we knew about genes, this school of thought, organic memory, explained instinct by collapsing memory into biological heredity. Instinct is the memory of the species. This is key for spinal catastrophism, which views our movement in time as different tempos of remembering and forgetting things about our previous states of existence. Freud, Ferenczi, and Jung would each build off of the notion of reflexes and instinct as types of inherited memory, taking these thoughts from the school of organic memory. German author Richard Seemann was one such researcher to follow in the school of organic memory, and formalized ideas put forth by Ewald Hering to create a vocabulary for the study of organic memory. Memes and engrams were referred to as carried memory traces. Engraphy was the study of these two things, and ecphory referred to recalling an engram from the depths of the mind. Memories were carried as microscopic alterations of the central nervous system, an idea which meant that the spinal cord was literally composed of nothing but ossified memory, or at least the record thereof. French psychologist T.A. Ribet in L'Hérédité harried this idea to propose an interesting thought. If This is true, that the spine and other parts of the central nervous system are nothing but composited layers of species-specific memory. An animal like the amphioxus, which possesses a spine but no head, would therefore possess no consciousness. It lacks the necessary brain to facilitate consciousness. However, if we are to go with the thought and say that such an animal is conscious, then we need to consider the possibility that the spine may be equally or nearly as conscious as the brain. Another gem of a line can be found on page 197. What is it like to be a back? It is like being an amphioxus. We all have a Lancelot lodged in our lumbar spine. This brings us to German zoologist Ernst Haeckel. Haeckel saw various protoplasms as deposits of memory within the body, existing as a sort of unconscious slurry. Protoplasmania was a very rife trope in sci-fi at the time, so it's no surprise that a zoologist or scientist like himself was trying to bring these ideas into the scientific fold. Haeckel also theorized that the difference between inorganic and organic matter is that organic matter is capable of engraphy and ecphory, while inorganic matter cannot have such memory traces. Furthermore, neuroplasm and psychoplasm were the specific substances used for memory inscription, and he saw living as totally being an act of recollecting your memories. These thoughts were carried further by English novelist Samuel Butler. Shot. Butler translated Haeckel and championed his work, saying that it put the backbone in the theory of evolution. For Butler and Haeckel, the memories of the sympathetic nervous system, or the autonomic nervous system, are just as rich as the brain and spinal marrow. This brings us to Edward von Hartmann, a 19th century German philosopher who was once spoken of in psychological communities in the same breath and reverence as Hegel. Hartmann's research triggered a pessimist movement in Germany, and he was eventually ridiculed by Nietzsche as being a bit of a joke. Hartmann had a background in neurology and rallied the engraphic ideas of the time. He believed that the whole neural system arrives, both in the development of the species and in the growth of the individual, from decentralized nervous nets that then centralized in the brain. Looking at the cross-section of various animal brains, we can see a successive centralization in the progression from fish to amphibian to bird to mammal to human. These nervous nets come together both as the individual forms and as the species becomes more derived, to form a more centralized feature. Part of Hartmann's research relied on the 18th century practice of somnambulism, where people were hypnotized into moving their sensory center down into the lower body, inducing inner body experiences. This lends credit to the idea that not only was the lower spinal system having thoughts of its own, but that you, as a person, could go down further into them and recall the experiences of the lower spine. Essentially, Hartmann thought that the lower body was having its own thoughts separate from the brain. Page 202. Schopenhauer himself had theorized that dreams are caused when the sleeping brain, starved of external stimuli and input from the sensory organs, makes up for this by intercepting interoceptive messages from the lower spinal regions and converting such signals into the brain's own native language, that of a spatio-temporally extended three-dimensional world. In other words, when we dream, we literally inhabit a spinal landscape. Oneurology is orthopedics. Oneurology is the study of dreams, by the way. We're coming back here to the idea that our dreaming state allows us to experience something that is deeper within us, but outside of our conscious present. We're also looking at the idea that the brain can only process signals that have been converted into the program language of the brain. Sometimes that means that inputs come out as nonsense, but it's only because the brain is only able to speak its language. The spine has its own consciousness, and although its actions are subject to the mastery of the brain, it still acts on its own thoughts when the opportunity arises, such as when the main brain is unconscious. Alien hand syndrome is another such case that comes to mind, or more appropriately, as Moynihan says, alien spine syndrome. With observations of degrees of spinal paralysis becoming noted in the 18th century, French and Scottish physicians and surgeons experimented with the spines of puppies and frogs to map the separate sensory and motor pathways in the backbone. English physiologist Marshall Hall was able to induce current in reflex arcs of decapitated eels and snakes, proving that everything from moving to vomiting was possible, all without a brain. It's a funny coincidence he's also using eels like Freud's, because reflex theory would later become the foundation of some of Lewis and Freud's theories. Haeckel would integrate this into a sort of cell communitarianism, where the body was more analogous to a zooid, or compound superorganism. Thinkers from Butler to Nietzsche to Velikovsky seized this idea of the separate spinal soul from the brain. Arthur Schopenhauer would later reference these experiments on anencephalic children, decapitated frogs, and dissected insects to put forth the existence, or the theory of the existence, of multiple spinal centers outside of the brain, a so-called swarm of spinal wills. Of course, Lewis complained that the Tarzan philosophers were repositioning the body as a self-sufficient commonwealth with the brain as an overseeing bureaucrat. Whether he was right or being needlessly contrarian, who knows? It's here that we get to the single longest annotation in this book. Starting with 5 lines at the bottom of page 207, this annotation stretches to cover the entirety of page 208 in the reduced font size before continuing over 4 lines on page 209. Mr. Thomas Moynihan. What? I really want to stress, this is an absurd length for an annotation when most of these are less than a line long. What is happening? What is this book? Nietzsche continues. Page 209. We know man as a plurality of animated beings that partly fight each other mutually, and partly, being ordered and subordinate to each other, also assert the whole involuntarily, through the assertion of their individual beings. In other words, Nietzsche thought that the actions and thoughts of an individual don't arise from the deliberate governance of any inner voices in the mind, like a singular conscious soul speaking within, but instead by the conflicting forces of the muscular, digestive, and neural structures all vying for control of the body's action. A noisy parliament of proto-brains. Consciousness here is seen as superfluous to the function of the body. It's not strictly necessary, and as a result, destined to disappear. There's still a bunch of really Nietzsche Kant philosophy stuff I don't quite get, but if you can peel through at your own leisure, good for you. Also, it's interesting to note, Nietzsche died of a syphilitic infection in his central nervous system, as he was starting to deal with dementia in his old age. Ironically, erasing the consciousness he once described as superfluous. L3. Modernity as whiplash and spondylosis. Nietzsche saw the emergence of now extinct neural disorders in the Victorian period as an overexcitation of Europe's shared nervous system, due to the emergence of telegraphy. Railway spine was a form of whiplash experienced from the acceleration of early train carriages. British surgeon John Erik Erikson documented the ailment's lasting psychological effects, including immobility, malaise, and complete psychological collapse. Again, there was no physical ailment or injury documented with railway spine. The symptoms seem to have originated sheerly from fright at moving at such a fast speed. Railway spine's prominence is seen through the lens of spinal catastrophism as a form of colony collapse, like in social insects such as bees and ants. The passenger spines were suddenly thrown out of sync from the biochronological present by the sudden accelerations and decelerations of railway movements. English psychologist James Sully and neurological surgeon Herbert Page used a similar chronological reasoning to rationalize railway spine as older neural functions becoming the foci of the mind over the newer functions of higher intellect, an accelerating present clashing against the inertia of a spinal past. The wider implication of this notion is that certain maladies or madnesses can actually be seen as expressions of behavior that are perfectly healthy for a more basal organism. But when these patterns of behavior are resurfaced in the descendant, they become discordant and unhealthy. Health, like the present, is a relative term. English neurologist John Hewlings Jackson described these devolutions as opening the floodgates for older behaviors to flow. What's pathological to the human present may be perfectly fine to our inner lizard brain. Page 218. From one perspective, pathology is the inertial drag of the past on the moving present, and from another perspective, such drag can only be caused by acceleration, which itself is nothing but the future arriving sooner. Schizophrenia is the collision of an encroaching future with a past outstaying its welcome. Illness and wellness are ratios of evolution and devolution in the same bodily frame. L4. German idealism and nature's most sublime flower. For Hegel, who balked at the idea that spines could seat multiple souls, the mind and spine were the remains of the soul's self-actualization, multiple moments of a liquid mind over time. The brain is the living head, the spine, the dead remnants. We previously discussed ideas of neuroplasticity, so the liquid mind here is referring to the grand scale of the human brain adapting to the pressures of rationalism. As segments reform to accommodate the pressures, the older survival functions get relegated downwards into the other areas of the body, and form the spine, so to speak. I would also be remiss to miss pointing out this cool quote from the annotations. Bone and flesh stand in antagonism, like air and earth. The muscle is that which is polarizing, moving. The bone is what is polarized, moved. Lorenz Oken, Elements of Physiophilosophy, page 306. Natural philosophy, developed by Schelling, promulgated a very recapitulist worldview. With every organic product, nature passes through all of the previous stages. Oken's work on the subject demonstrates excellently the parallelism of these ideas. Nature's varied stages of evolutionary production originated from a generative zero and ascend upwards. On page 223, this ascension is outlined explicitly. We move from pneumatology, the study of spirit, to phylogeny, the development and diversification of a group of organisms across time, into cosmogony, the study of universal origins, into stoichology, the study of the elemental origins, to geology, the study of the earth, to organogeny, the study of organic matter, to phytonogeny, the study of plants, to zoology, the study of animals, to psychology, the study of the mind, are passed through again and again each time the organism matures. Oken saw the human skull as simply a repetition of the lower vertebrae. Our jaws found parallels in the limbs. Our teeth were nothing but nails. Expanding this out, if the organic world is not but recapitulation of the inorganic world, then the geological facets that can be found on planet Earth should hold parallels in biology. Nails are nothing but stalactites, metaphorically speaking. The terrestrial organs of mountains and mantle and cave and ocean form an organism called a planet, recapitulated in the earliest forms of the vertebrate embryo. These theories would like us to believe that the difference between animal, vegetable, and mineral is so much less than we might otherwise think. Oken and his peers took our orthograde posture as consubstantial with vegetal erection. Schelling, the earth blossoms in the human brain. Just as plants are drawn upwards to the sun, the return from horizontal posture to vertical within the human being represents a jailbreak, a return to an erect, organized entity in the animalia branch. Oken, like many other thinkers before him, also saw spheres as perfect. Our vertical posture, capped by a sphere, felt like a good pairing, and his peers likened the skull of the human body to a planet. In the line of spinal catastrophist thinking, given the inner world of the brain's dissimulation, it's only appropriate that an object containing an inner world would come to morphologically resemble the outer world. Similar notions to the idea that the brain is equal to a planet are called inevitable by Moynihan, invoking Johann Gottlieb Fichte's identity system and the reflexive properties of mathematics. Unfortunately, this does reveal more implications. If you'll notice, the majority of the planet is dead, actually, or at least inorganic. There's not a lot of life deeper than the mantle. English physician Erasmus Darwin originated the idea of geozoism, that the entire lithosphere is biogenic. Inspired by islands that made coral reefs, he expanded a similar notion to the rest of the planet, to give a biotic nucleus to the Earth. This would posit a situation where it's not a planet that is generating life, but life that is generating a planet. However, do note that it was about this period that the word inorganic gained scientific meaning, and geozoism didn't last that long. Discussions of primeval igneous deposits, which contained no fossils, painted a picture of a period of time and areas of the planet that were utterly devoid of life. Earth is not alive. We are a layer of mold atop a churning, dead, and telluric hulk. The advent of tectonic theory wiped away previously comforting notions, and the ground we walked upon was no longer certain and lawful. So, if we combine notions that all life contains the rest of the world preceding it, and that most of the world preceding it is inhospitable to life, then roughly 1,599 out of 1,600 parts of our being are dead, inorganic, inactive, an ulcer we might call the unconscious. Recapitulation's attempt to retain identity in the face of natural history consequently sacrifices the integrity of the law of continuity. Self-inclusion is now stratified layers of self-exclusion. Including the history of what we are tells us that we are made mostly in the image of dead matter. As Schopenhauer states, consciousness is the surface of the mind, and of this, as of the globe, we do not know the interior, but only the outer crust. L5. Cosmic History as a Series of Ossicles. Samuel Taylor Coleridge was an ambitious philosopher obsessed with the dark groundwork of our nature, his work remaining in scattered notebooks brought together here by Moynihan. Coleridge believed that what was contained in fetal development was much more interesting than anything that came after, because in that process was contained the whole of cosmic evolution, as per the theory of recapitulation. Possibly the first real British post-Kantian thinker, he couldn't accept what he called Fichte's subjective idealism. He saw the natural philosophan thinkers as rising above this, with Schelling's thinkings being a cure to the many phantoms that lingered within modern nature and thought. Coleridge would eventually distance himself from such works later on, but always kept an eye on him, and retained recapitulist thinking in his own works. He described the ascendancy of the human fetus through the stages of plant, insect, and animal as fact, not theory. Coleridge would work with English philanthropist John Henry Green to systematize a universal genetic history, or a physiogeny. In volume 5 of his notebooks, he would write, "Method is that each evolute suggests the next, and throws back light on the former. In other words, our current form suggests where we're going, and reveals much about where we came from." The emerging science of chemistry at this time, which showed nature to create products that were qualitatively different from their reactants, was key to giving rise to this direction of research. You need to remember, as I found in my own forays into the field of classical elemental theory, the ancients believed that the universe was made of elemental substances that retained their properties as they combined to form the universe around us. It was novel and revolutionary then to suggest that instead, real substances could change their properties upon combination. If you want to illustrate this, you could think of the meme of sodium and chlorine, a toxic metal and a toxic gas, combining to form the relatively harmless sodium chloride, table salt. Physiogeny saw each individual product as simultaneously different from, but containing fully, its precursors. We also get more notes here on biology containing traces of geology, an interesting one being the metallic calcium structures found within our ear. Page 238. Sound is volatile metal. Our hearing apparatus arrives from inorganic accelerometers found within ancient fish. In other words, one of our advanced methods for sensing the world and becoming more aware of it arose from a means of detecting change in velocity across time. This function evolved in our aquatic ancestors and became radically changed in the transition to land. The eardrum in this example ties together so much of what we've been talking about. These connections, as Oken described, formed a grand and unified bone system, all just rows of ossicles repeated in various forms, tying mountains to rib cages by the same structuring phenomenon. Georges Buffon, a French philosopher, theorized aging as the gradual ossification of body fibers, an accumulation of inorganic minerals as it overtook the organic domain. This creates a situation where the processes of living gradually devour themselves. Claude Nicolas Lecat would similarly write that, due to the mechanics of growth across a human lifespan, the fact that we only got so big meant that we became continually more mineralized by aging. He reasoned that because we continued to keep making minerals internally, but didn't get proportionally bigger to accommodate these changes, our body mass became more and more mineral over time. He saw kidney stones as clear evidence of this, whether or not that was an accurate display of the theory. Samuel Coleridge would later become grasped by a theory of hydatids, explaining that all nervous diseases were eruptions of inorganic activity in the nerves. Dead matter from the past becomes active and starts inhabiting the living. Page 240. Disease isn't just relapse into prior organic states, but a resurgence of prior inorganic ones. CNS degeneration, again, as chronopathic decentralization. Illness is a form of relapse, a sink back into the mind of an inanimate animal, and then further back into the inorganic universe. Finishing off lumbar genesis, we see more discussions of pineal calcification, revealing that thinking like a planet is liable to give you brain sand. And somehow, all of this explains why demons and devils might have horns. This is a wild book, and I don't know what to tell you. These tangentially but ultimately extraneous ramblings, which are more clearly explained by reading the book, eventually lead us to the first real kindlings of spinal catastrophism in the Romanticism movement of 18th century Europe. Sacral inception, 1800 to 1750. Here we find ourselves working with some very old thinkers who were foundational to the fields of psychology and anthropology, and our understanding of the human mind as a whole. Nestled here are the seedling realizations and rationalizations of the ideas that would one day evolve into spinal catastrophism. S1. The oldest system program of cosmotraumatics. German philosopher Johann Gottfried Herder was a key precursor to Schellingian natural philosophy. His 1784 Ideen zu Philosophie der Geistig der Menschheit presents perhaps the first truly genetic developmental vision of hominization, or the process of becoming human, kick-starting the tradition of philosophical anthropology. Many of the ideas we earlier encountered in this video originate here. His theories placed orthograde posture at the center of humanity's genesis, while also implying his belief that it is the connection between the human vocal system and our capacity for rational thought that has shaped our body to be what it is. The more that the body endeavors to raise itself, and the head to mount upwards from the skeleton, the more perfect is the creature's form. The jury is still out on his opinions of sauropods. This is an idea that we see echoed in later theorizing by Alsberg and Galen of the mechanics of vertical vertebral posture in the development of language. He sees our erect posture and recognizes that it is the defining factor that sets us apart from the rest of the animal kingdom. Moynihan also takes the time to identify some of the connections between Herder and his succeeding thinkers through some of their ideas. Page 251. Like Bataille, he divines the significance of man's prodigious long great toe, Like Ferenczi and Reich, he stresses the temporary axial phyletic relapse that occurs during sleep. Like Freud, he remarks upon the anthropogenic priority of vertical ocularity over horizontal olfaction. Essentially, it was Herder's belief that rationality was a byproduct of nature's drive to create a rational animal. Rationality followed forth from nature, from an unavoidable part of the natural universe. Concluding Herder's thoughts, it is infinitely beautiful to observe the gradation by which nature has gradually led her creatures up to sound and voice. But as Moynihan writes, page 253, Kant, Herder's one-time tutor, convulsively disagreed. He saw that Herder, through stressing the telic identity of rationality and bipedality, was unduly naturalizing reason, immuring it, limiting it, reducing it to a psychological quirk. To counteract this, Kant would take extreme measures, urging that rationality didn't arise because of uprightness, but that uprightness arose because of rationality. Orthograde locomotion develops in spite of nature, a chronic symptom of reason alone, arriving in conflict with organic interests. To prove his argument, Kant, in uncharacteristic action, indulges in a nearly sadistic assault of the orthograde form. He points out every flaw, every self-limiting and painful quirk of human anatomy. Kant concludes that orthograde rationality isn't just not a product of natural evolution, but, in fact, antithetical to the ends of species procreation, and thus antithetical to human survival itself. A fact that you should hold on to, as it will become evidently important later. Therefore, reason has to come before standing upright in this chicken-egg scenario. Page 255. Standing upright is truly steadfast standing, therefore defiant to the point of species suicide. Ergo, only after the germ of something alien entered, that germ of reason, as Kant put it, did man fall upward. Moynihan continues. Yanked to its feet by the stern, inflexible puppet master of reason, nature literally miscarries itself within human morphology. Here, the overemphasis on rationality's exogenicity deviates into epidemiology. It is a virus come from outside. In other words, Moynihan rephrases Kant's line of reasoning to point out that he is positioning reason as something alien, something outside, as something not just alien, but insidious, virus-like. Kant's arguments have unforeseen consequences. In Swift and Terrible Motions, Kant firmly and inadvertently establishes intelligence as a parasite. His desire to maintain rational purity inadvertently repaints the transcendence of reason as malignant and invasive, the eternity of time binding itself to a hapless animal host puppet. And then on the next page, 259, Moynihan uses the word braggadocious. Outstanding. Schopenhauer would be the first philosopher to truly develop the consequences of Kant's purism. The survival of brainless abortions and the evidence of a spinal soul proved that the brain was superfluous for organic reproduction. The brain, the fruit and noxious blossom of the human tree, was an invader grafted on by a spinal root, absorbing energy from the body without providing necessary function in turn. Nay, not just not providing necessary function, but restricting the functions of the other parts of the natural body in order to further its own means. This notion originated by Friedrich Tiedemann that the development of the central nervous system was through a metaviral infection is known as the parasitological theory of neurulation, the profound and troubling implications of which are essential to spinal catastrophism. That implication? That Burroughs was right. If the central nervous system is a parasite, then reality itself, or our ability to perceive, understand, and partake in it, is the symptom of an infection, a virus that causes an awareness that causes pain. And if one seeks to minimize pain, the logical follow-up is to ask. Page 260. What is the therapeutic path? Is there one? How can we remedy a wound the size of existence? Total recall is the only therapeutic route. When presented with an infection such as the brain, eudaimonia and euthanasia converge. Note here that eudaimonia refers to the pursuit of human flourishing, while euthanasia is... well, I imagine you know what euthanasia means. To quote Will Wood, "Good news to the purists. They've discovered a cure for the symptoms of being alive. It's a painless procedure with a low rate of failure, but very few patients survive." The pursuit of an understanding of the human condition reveals that it just kind of sucks by design. Existence is pain, and if you want to eliminate suffering at the root, you must remove the trunk of this pineal nerve blossom we call a brain. So, that's a lot of doom and gloom, but don't touch that dial, cause it gets worse. As Schopenhauer said, the rest of nature has to expect its salvation from man. We said here in earlier chapters that because man stands upright, they are responsible for falling down. Every instance in which we relapse back into the animal state is simply our fault from falling away from rationalization. Therefore, it is our responsibility not just to keep ourselves out of the animalistic state, but to watch over the animalistic state, merely by the power we exert over the rest of the planet. If it can be expected that any state comparable to our own sentience is present or will ever be present in the rest of the kingdom of life, and if we see the prevention of suffering as good, then we, as the most powerful known agents in existence, are obligated to engage in an extreme and total act of antinatalism. Furthermore, as Moynihan reasons from our previous arguments, once the animal world has been extinguished, it follows that there would be nothing to observe the inanimate universe. We hypothesized in our previous discussions of chronotopes and chronopathy that time itself is possibly the excretion of our own thinking. If nothing is around to observe the universe, then it would be as if the universe didn't exist anymore. Something of a tree falling in the forest scenario, except that the trees are dead too. This burden of sorts, as Schopenhauer describes, places the human animal in a strange position. It is at once sin, savior, and sacrifice. The self-aware weed, the brain, is tasked by the universe with pulling itself out by the root. Edward von Hartmann would later take this analysis by Kant and Schopenhauer even further. Hartmann essentially said that a being is happier the stupider its nervous system is. The less intelligent a life form is, the less pain it is capable of feeling in proportion to pleasure. An oyster feels less pain than a fish, which feels less pain than a horse, which ideally feels less pain than us. The more complicated your brain, the more pain you're going to feel. Page 264. Encephalization is a procession of ever more exquisite forms of torment. Imprisonment within the petals of ever more extravagant delusional dream flowers. An ever more distressing thought when you tie this back to our ideas of dissimulation through simulation. Hartmann was an extreme advocate of the antinatalist position, but went even further to proclaim that humanity itself should actively take a role in not just preventing future generations, but annihilating that which exists already. However, American writer Edgar Saltus thought even human extinction was too tame of a solution. Moynihan describes his writings, saying that the only therapeutic path, when faced with the cosmotrauma of wounded galaxies, is active termination rather than passive renunciation. Trauma didn't begin with us. We are its mere byproduct. And thus, in order to treat the wound, we must not only destroy the nervous system, but the very principle of productivity that creates it, to usher in the Great Quietus. Moynihan then takes a little side stroll through the ideas of self-realization and the Earl idealist drama, replacing the ultimate goal of self-consciousness through self-reflection with awareness of suffering through pain perception. Neat stuff. Wish I fully understood it. Now, let's talk about Russia instead. Beating Hartmann to the punch by 2 decades was the eccentric priest Vladimir Odoyevsky, otherwise known as the Russian Faust. In 1844, he wrote a short vignette titled The Last Suicide that Moynihan describes as the oldest system program of cosmotraumatics. In other words, the oldest established system put into writing describing the nature of cosmotraumatics, the relation between ourselves, the universe, and the innate trauma carried from one to the other. In the story of The Last Suicide, Earth becomes an ecumenopolis, or a city world, where the slow-motion explosion of urban expansion unfolds to cover the entire globe. The telegraphic network of communication spreads like a plague, in combination with actual plague. Odoyevsky wrote that in this situation, everything was bursting with life, but life was killing itself. As humanity becomes overcrowded, sickly, and maddened, fanatic priests emerge to chronicle the histories of man's pain, gripped by the idea of omnicide. Moynihan explains, an avid reader of Schelling and his peers, Odoyevsky here renders a natural philosophy that cancels life and vitality as protagonists of the world process, replacing them with colossal suffering. What is a spine and a brain other than a way for trauma to enter into self-relation and recollect its history? That is a startling thought. In most forms of anthropological or biological analysis in general, it is vitality, the continuation of life, its flourishing, that is seen as the primary object of focus, the thing we care about, the thing we want to happen, the thing that is driving everything else around it and reacting to the forces of the inorganic universe. Odoyevsky flips that on its head. Life and vitality are not the main characters, suffering is. It is suffering that is not just driving every function of biological continuation, but the nature of the universe itself, its progression from the grandiosity of the cosmos into geological history, into biological history, into hominid history. It is suffering that has caused all of this to take place, and it is suffering that uses the brain and body to enter into self-relation and to recognize itself. Existence and life are painted as intentional and malevolent entities, cruelly demanding the suffering of one class of life for another to prosper, introducing heightened ways of feeling so as to increase the feeling of pain. Abiogenesis is an insurrection from peaceful, placid, and inorganic repose. Page 269. Evolution is the engine for pain optimization. A cerebrospinal system is just a way for suffering to feel itself. As the title of The Last Suicide would imply, the ending to all of this comes when future Earth goes out with a bang, by literally lining the planet with explosives and making a slow-motion explosion into a, regular explosion. Depressing stuff. But back to Hartmann. Hartmann ends his relevant writings with a series of practical suggestions. If the annihilation of consciousness is the ultimate end goal, which all intermediate goals should serve, destroying the biosphere of Earth isn't enough. We must remove all potential for future nervous systems. Page 272. Our solemn task is thus to become the universe's way of... I'm not going to say this section for monetization. I don't know that this video is going to get monetized as is. For we can't just destroy ourselves. It is our duty to destroy everything. Otherwise, the world process is just going to spit out another upright ape or a similarly miserable creature, prolonging the suffering until they might eventually come to the same conclusions. To act mercifully would be to act swiftly and to act totally. As Moynihan writes, we must become ground zero for infinite negation's entrance into finite time. Superlative extinction. If we reach the endpoint where perception is no more, at that same point, chronogenesis implies that this would be the end of time itself. There would be no more suffering, no more death, no more life. If humanity couldn't do it, our successors will. And if they don't, some upright alien civilization should eventually be up to the task. But as Daniel Charles Barker would realize, listening for signals from the cosmos, we're still here. Which means that any alien activists are either late on the draw, or they're not firing at all. Coccygeal postscriptum. With the realization of existence's cruelty brought before us, along with a potential solution to our troubles, we're left to ask why no one thought of this before. Here, bringing ourselves back to the formal congealment of spinal catastrophism under Charles Barker, we find ourselves even more troubling news. Why are the skies so silent? Just where is everyone? Where are the feats of astroengineering, the Dyson spheres, the spacefaring exo-civilizations? This is the astrobiological ubi sunt que ante nos ferunt. Where are those that were before us? Do we groaneth and travaileth alone in creation? Such were the ultimately inward-looking questions that led Barker to begin charting the most intimately inward, and to turn from astronomical signalectics to the spine. After all we've learned so far, if this is the solution, if this is to be taken at face value as the thing that needs to be done in order to make everything better, to solve our suffering, to remedy the human condition, why hasn't it been done before? Why are we still around here to experience it ourselves? Why hasn't some other alien civilization at least given it a shot? At least to where we could recognize that it's happened or happening or tried to happen in the past. But after all we've learned so far, the answer, in hindsight, may seem obvious. The relationship of the vegetative ANS and complexified CNS is something between telic antagonistic, parasitic, and an unstable alliance. In a paper titled The Intelligence Paradox, nutritional scientists A.V.W. Nunn, G.W. Guy, and J.D. Bell propose that intelligence is self-canceling. The evolution of intelligence is driven by environmental stressors that adapt the organism to become anticipative and produce resilient responses. Whether those environmental stressors are due to suffering or reason or nature, whatever the fuck you want to take from the above hypotheses, it's all the same. The organism is driven to become intelligent because of outside factors. The organism may ultimately tend towards reformatting the environment that has produced it to fulfill its needs and reduce those stressors. The natural is then inducted into the artifactual, becoming completely overrun by what was created by the creation. At some tipping point, the intelligence succeeds in alleviating the stressors that drove it to existence in the first place. Page 281. Intelligence is self-limiting. It erases the very contexts that create and maintain it. That is the intelligence paradox. Even the commanding power of the central nervous system becomes turned on itself as the desires of the body fester and overwhelm our better judgment through acts of flagrant gluttony. Look at diabetes, pandemics of metabolic illness, and other certifiably first world problems, and you'll see, in the environment we've created, having a brain just doesn't pay as much as it used to, and our bodies face less rigifying stressors than ever. Alien civilizations, assumed to be like us, likely aren't following our previous notions of a path to spacefaring futures. They, like us, become too fat for space. The paper calculates that we already spend too much on obesity, healthcare, and fittingly enough, back pain each year to afford in investing in serious spacefaring efforts. Page 283. This would be the ultimate revenge of the vegetative system on the nervous system. The stomach gets the last laugh, turning on the spinal cord by dragging both into a mutual oblivion brought on by their own collaborative success. We drink too much Pepsi to go to the stars. This solution to the Fermi Paradox, the galactic stomachache. Technology increasingly gives us more of what we want, but it's not leading us to an advanced universal simulation or a broad cosmic community. We're not doing what we thought we were going to 50, 60 odd years ago. We're collapsing back into the worst parts of what it means to be human. The brain can't achieve escape velocity from its own libidinous spine. We evolved to stare vertically into a sky we'll never reach. Call that a cruel entropy's thesis. Ultimately, the jump from stellar scholastics to spinal studies appeared to have ended in Barker's own madness, as he used his body as a metaphorical, literal, somewhere in betweenical lens into the universal history hidden within our biology. A fate apparently not uncommon for the thinkers we've revisited here. Page 298. So many different types of thinkers. Rationalists and vitalists, psychoanalysts and Marxists, natural philosophers and anthropologists, penis poets and utopian futurists, libertine theophiliacs and moral rigorists, Tarzan philosophers and uchronic enlighteners, proponents and practitioners from both day and night sides of natural science, have been drawn to this distinctively hypergenealogical motif. Even Kant, in spite of his right-mindedness, couldn't help but read catastrophes into the spine, and in doing so, made a superlative mess of himself. Recapitulalism attempted to naturalize our odd conditions, but it only succeeded in giving the sense that there is something cosmically damaged about the upright human being, highlighting the ways in which the flaws of intelligence interfere with time itself. Moynihan concludes, at long last, after all of these somber notes, with this. But the ancestral spine, in relation to our regal brain, may yet yield portents and clues, providing the crooked key to the Menschheit Rätsel, the riddle of the human's complicity with the cosmos that produced it, and offering a roadmap of the highways of history upon which our deepest past intersects with our future, or lack thereof. Man is the embodied impossibility. He is the animal that lives anyways, or so Blumenberg said. The truth of this statement has yet to be determined. Mind may very well be at the end of its bony tether. So from here on is the section of the video that was rewrote after I published part 1 of the annotations. 2 years of thinking about the topic, plus a few hundred YouTube comments, revealed a wealth of additional information. If I've done my job here, then hopefully your mind is as equally blown as mine was by the conclusions of this book. Probably not, it hits harder when you're reading, but still, the video must move forward. So, what exactly does all of this mean for us? You, me, humans, conscious observers, people with spines. This is where we exit the annotations section of the video and get to my personal interjections. Because I know we just went over a lot, I'm going to try and summarize what I feel are the 8 biggest ideas in spinal catastrophism. 1. Hypergenealogy. I don't feel like I fully understood this when writing the section on it originally, so here's a short redo. Genealogy is the study of families, the origins of individuals, and philosophical genealogy covers the origins of ideas, of rational arguments, the search for causes masquerading as reasons. This is a reference to Robert Brandom, who spoke of how the genealogical contexts of an individual provide beliefs that are not attained by our reasoning, but ingrained by upbringing and then rationalized thereafter. Baptists raise Baptists, Muslims raise Muslims, and atheists, they don't raise anyone. Hypergenealogy is an extension of this idea. Genealogy thrust back on itself, taking a step back to look at the origins genealogy claims to have found and finding their origins as well. Breaking from the linear nature of ordinary genealogy, it establishes a recursive structure of ideas, ideas about ideas, and where they all came from. It abandons accountability to the claims it stakes in an impious act of unselective exploration. This can end up being a bit spray and pray. In the pursuit of guiding principles which determine the ultimate shapes and properties of a structure, it necessarily requires tracking down dead ends, ideas that don't necessarily tie back into the whole, which sometimes contradict its other parts. The little spoken of aunts and uncles and cousins who became genetic dead ends in this philosophical family tree. But by covering each member, a fuller vision of the causal chain is established. It's a necessary step, and this methodology is what defines the shape of the rest of the book. This is the starting point that Moynihan had to establish for all of us to get on board. 2. Facilitation of human reason by the bipedal stance, and vice versa. Much energy is spent establishing the connection between our upward gait and our capacity for reason, language, and greater agency than other animals. The connections between horizon, perspective, and our primary senses supported a recursive development in neural anatomy. These patterns of encephalization, or forming brains, formed nested simulations of simulations. These simulations make us more invested in reality the more we engage with it. Time coagulates into the brain, and our understanding and relying upon of chronological aspects of reality has strengthened as our brains developed, speaking both as species and individuals. This transition from being inert, radially symmetric organisms into being bilateral ones with a front and a back implies a vector of movement, a teleology, in which our original sin, fortunate fault, falling upwards, whatever you would like to call it, is ultimately for some unknown goal, or at least there is a determinable end that it is reaching towards. 3. The theory of recapitulation and the law of superposition. These are technically separate ideas, but they are very entwined. You could also call them continuous identity and depth as memory. These ideas are necessary for establishing the spine as an archaeological artifact, which carries traces of our ancestral lineages. Our bones themselves become a genealogy. We contain dead multitudes of the organic and inorganic past. The traumas of the past are carried within us. These traumas are a ripple through repeating patterns in biology and geology. Thin and robust outer layers form over massive dead interiors. Your cranium takes the same shape as a planet. Your body and the earth itself are repeating ossicles of teeth, arms, and stalagmites. We also have the idea of the metastructure of nervous systems. Encephalization extends outward on individual, societal, geographical, interplanetary, and cosmological scales, i.e., telegraphs, globalization. It's brains all the way down. 4. Distinction between the central and autonomic nervous systems. Next, Moynihan established the individuality of the nervous organs. The autonomic nervous system, ANS, serves very different functions than and can operate separately from the central nervous system, CNS. It must be for a body to function. The side effects of this have massive ramifications for how we view the inner world of the body. There's Napoleon/Caesar's vertebral communications with their followers. There's schizophrenics and their warring inner voices, representative of the clash of the CNS and ANS. There's headless natures of dreams and sleep. They're temporary decapitations that happen as we delve into the unconscious. And lastly, the superfluous nature of the brain. With its lack of functions strictly necessary to the body's survival, intellect can be positioned in this way as a parasitic ruling class over the rest of human anatomy. 5. The parasitological theory of neurulation. This theory posits that the central nervous system is a mutation brought about by reason, seen here as a parasitic organism to further reason's propagation through language. Reason may not be the correct entity to assign here, but I think that's what he's getting at, and it works well enough for our purposes. Dragging the ape upwards by its tongue, reason took advantage of our innate neuroplasticity to traumatically shape our physiology for its own needs. 6. The self-externalization of trauma. Brains can be seen as the dream flowers of the spinal tree. They're the extravagant and showy results of an underlying procession from unconscious existence to conscious existence. The purpose of this was the optimization of the pain engine. While Carl Sagan would say that we are a way for the universe to know itself, Thomas Moynihan spins this into, we are a way for the universe's suffering to feel itself. Existence is presented as a cruel injury inflicted upon a hapless and otherwise inert universe. Every step from Big Bang to supernova to planetary formation to abiogenesis to Cambrian explosion to transition to land to ice age extinction to upright posture was a traumatic scar retained by the organisms that resulted from them. This is generational trauma going back further than single-cell organisms. 7. Universal negation as a cure for trauma. If we see suffering as bad, and we see this trauma as the root of suffering, then many philosophers in this line of thinking would think that to eradicate trauma, we have to remove the systems preserving it. We, living creatures, sophonts, sapient entities, are those systems. To thoroughly eliminate suffering, we must seek the eradication of all possibility for a nervous system to emerge, now or in the future. We're presented with the ethical duty not just for self-destruction, but universal annihilation. Not advocating for it, that's just what the book is saying. And lastly, 8. The solution to the Fermi Paradox. If we assume that the source of intelligence and rational behavior is correlated highly to orthograde posture, then alien civilizations resulting from our shared universe would share the issues that we see here, and might seek to resolve them in the ways we outlined above. But, because we're still here, we know they haven't done this yet. The question is whether they haven't emerged to do it, haven't attempted to, or were unable to. The intelligence paradox is the idea that intelligence erases the need for intelligence. We solve our natural problems to such an extent that the need for those problem-solving faculties is removed. Natural selection disengages. The modern world enables the ANS's urges to overpower the brain. Both are dragged into oblivion because the solutions to our overarching problems address enough symptoms that the solutions become infeasible to maintain. Total civilizational collapse ensues as our mind's bony tethers keep us from ever reaching the stars. Now that we've reviewed what the book is saying, what does this mean for us? Should we start forming omnicide cults and petitioning the UN to stockpile nuclear arms? In my opinion, no. In the comments of the last video, a lot of you seemed to take these ideas and run with them. While I appreciate your enthusiasm, you don't have the full picture. I feel that on some level, the lack of a preface about the nature of this book's writings was irresponsible of me. I knew something that you didn't, and I let you go on without it for the sake of crafting a certain audience experience. While that's not an invalid reason, the time investment to resolve that experience and the distance between the release of Part 1 and Part 2 created room for people to miss the point. There's a lot that we're not accounting for here. First of all, accepting the conclusion of the book requires we take all of its assumptions on good faith and accept what it's saying at face value. Because the hypergenealogical nature of spinal catastrophism crosses so many intellectual domains, it's treading on a bit of everything and not accounting for all of the consequences. Which is the point. That's why we had a big discussion of hypergenealogy in the first chapter. Its perspective is not one concerned with making the most solid arguments, but putting forth the most arguments in favor of exploring interesting and novel trains of thought. Take a look at nearly any argument the book puts forth, and you'll find a plethora of literature and academic papers disputing or disproving even the point being made. Case in point, the joke that is aquatic ape theory. To give a personal example, I'm Christian, and if I can put forth any evidence that God is an active agent in this scenario, the entire dialogue falls apart. In one move, I would introduce another layer of discussion that provides an afterlife to escape the traumatics, a possibly benevolent designer entity that has motives beyond what we can divine through pure reason, an explanation for the human body plan other than parasitic rationality, and motivation for us to not commit seppuku for fear of damnation. You don't even have to take this explanation if you're not fond of Christian ethics. Thomas Moynihan himself, in an article for The Wire on November 11, 2020, points to the proposed solutions left antinatalists like Hartman and Schopenhauer and exposes the major flaw in their logic. Hartman was convinced that this was the purpose of creation, that our universe exists to evolve beings compassionate and clever enough to decide to abolish existence itself. Hartman's philosophy is fascinating. It is also unimaginably wrong. This is because he confuses the eradication of suffering with the eradication of sufferers. Conflating this distinction leads to crazy visions of omnicide. To get rid of suffering, you don't need to get rid of sufferers. You could instead try removing the causes of pain. We should eliminate suffering, not the sufferer. Pick a thread through this book. Follow the arguments back and find the base assumptions that support them. Pull hard enough, and I assure you it all falls apart. Which is okay, because this isn't supposed to be a comprehensive worldview packaged in a silver bullet ergonomic novel. It's a recollection of the history of a group of ideas, starting with the most contemporary and working our way back to the earliest traces. That on its own is a novel and worthwhile endeavor to follow, because it reveals a lot about the way people think and have thought. Furthermore, I argue this entire academic exercise is worthwhile in itself because it both helps to familiarize readers with obscure scholarly concepts and recontextualizes our perspective on well-known thinkers like Kant, Freud, Jung, etc. I think I've learned more about philosophy and natural science in the pursuit of understanding this book than over the course of earning my entire engineering degree. I know more words, big words, complicated words, and my mind is better off for having overcome the challenge of reading this book. But on top of all of this, there's another, way more interesting layer to this book that we haven't even begun to discuss yet. Spoiler warning, which is strange because I know we've just finished a full book annotation, but we've read stranger things today. The big reveal comes at last. This book is a lie. It's not true. This is not a work of non-fiction. The book, Spinal Catastrophism, written by Thomas Moynihan, is a work of non-fiction, otherwise known as theory fiction. That is, it is a narrative more concerned with expressing ideas than it is with telling a story congruent to reality or storytelling convention. Here, Thomas Moynihan plays the character of himself, except in a world where a number of bizarre and esoteric thinkers coalesce into a secret history of the human spine, a theory called Spinal Catastrophism. One of the gifts I received from Urbanomic following the last video was a copy of Chronosis, a graphic novel by Riza Negarestani, an Iranian author who pioneered the genre of theory fiction in Cyclonopedia. Cyclonopedia is a travel narrative exploring the relationship between oil, war, Middle Eastern history, and the power of the sun, combining these concepts in a way that spiritually precedes Spinal Catastrophism and works like it. Illustrating this excellently is the originator of this theory himself, the person who came up with the term Spinal Catastrophism, Daniel Charles Barker. He's not a real person. Miskatonic Virtual University's webpage says the following. Daniel Charles Barker was a professor of anorganic semiotics at Kingsport College, MVU, Massachusetts, from 1992 to 2000. His extraordinary intellectual achievements resist easy summarization. involving profound and polymathic engagement across the entire range of life and earth sciences, in addition to archaeocultural research, mathematical semiotics, anatomical linguistics, and informatic engineering. Trained as a cryptographer in the early 1970s, he has spent his life decoding ancient scripts, quasi-biotic residues, and anomalous mineral patterns, amongst other things. A formulator of tick Z-notation, Professor Barker's work has been invaluable to the numerology of MVU. While that sounds like it could be the college campus biography of some random professor, the reality is that Barker is simply a fictional character created by an organization called the CCRU. Although they might prefer you refer to him as a hyperstitional entity. Wikipedia explains, the Cybernetic Cultural Research Unit, CCRU, or CRU, was an experimental cultural theorist collective formed in late 1995 at Warwick University, England, and gradually separated from academia until it dissolved in 2003. It garnered a reputation for its idiosyncratic and surreal works of theory fiction, which incorporated cyberpunk and gothic horror. The group's work has since garnered an online cult following. Warwick University maintains that CRU was never a sanctioned academic project, with some faculty going as far as to assert that the CCRU never existed. The CCRU are strongly associated with their former leading members, Sadie Plant, the mother of cyberfeminism, and Nick Land, otherwise known as the father of accelerationism. The thinkers involved in CRU have published a spectrum of strange literature in the last 3 decades, with works equal part culturally introspective and culturally impactful. I've lately been enjoying Orrin McIntyre's breakdown of Land's Meltdown essay. A number of CCRU pieces are chronicled in the anthology CRU Writings 1997 to 2003, a 300-page book I also read in pursuit of researching this video. And if you thought Spinal Catastrophism was strange, this isn't half of what they've got in the back. Daniel Charles Barker represents only one of the fictional entities serving as mouthpieces for the horrifying and surreal ideas the CCRU writers put forth. The interview, quote-unquote, where spinal catastrophism was coined, Barker Speaks, is nestled in CCRU writings between discussions of numerology, layered pseudo-Atlantean secret societies, the lost continent of Lemuria, and decadence, the playing card game that lets you talk to demons. In the fiction of the CCRU, hyperstitional concepts are ideas that have proven themselves successful in the cultural arena, to a degree that they take upon themselves a life of their own, a la Deleuze and Guattari's Bodies Without Organs. Yeah, we can't talk to them, but in CRU's eyes, they're not any more real or less fake than we are. Every mode of presenting the nature of existence, be it religion, intentional hoax, or observable universe, is at least partially a lie, equally as unreal as any other, with egos and media narratives and historical virtual fallacies all on level ground. They pose a fascinating, paradoxical world where metaphysical forces vie for control of the cosmic narrative. It's all a bit much to discuss, so let's dial back in on spinal catastrophism for a moment. What I find interesting about this book is that a heavy academic piece like itself was spawned from essentially a one-off segment of Nick Land's writing collections. Thomas Moynihan, who, as best I can tell, is a different person from and unrelated to the initial CCRU group, took that idea and ran with it, envisioning a fully fleshed work of theory fiction that stands on its own merits, at least ignoring any argumentative fallacies central to hypergenealogy. Pieces like Barker Speaks provide the seeds for new writing prompts in a connected universe of literature. Aristides Erkopoulos, who you might remember from Spinal Catastrophism for his contributions to discussions of astroarchaeology, is a fictional character from The Perfect Vacuum, a book written by the late Polish sci-fi author Stanislaw Lem. Maximilian Krab, the eccentric researcher from TH11 who divided his body into several vats at the bottom of the ocean, a hyperstitional entity straight from the CCRU. I haven't the time or energy to comb through this book a third time and pick out every suspect character, but you get the idea. I could go on and on about the strange world surrounding Nick Land, extending from his cyberpunk to dark Enlightenment philosophy to Bitcoin to the alt-right and alt-left. I started reading Fanged Noumena, possibly the definitive collection of his work, and it's just bonkers, man. I can see the strands of philosophical discussion that Moynihan pulled from to write Spinal Catastrophism. Land's discussions cover Kant, capital, synthetic a priori knowledge, poetry, werewolves, mid-20th century political powers, and most frightening of all, women, in ways that shed light on the machinations, achievements, and failures of historical thinkers like none I've ever seen before. Lord knows, I still don't know quite what the fuck he's talking about. If there are any further comments for me to make about this man and the world that is connected to them, I feel they're best reserved for another time. But this video is getting long enough as is. In conclusion, Spinal Catastrophism is like no book I have ever read before. Although it is a little bit like CCRU Writings, the book I read after, but that's besides the point. It has taken me through a journey of discovery about the nature of fictional writing, and my perspective of the human condition. As well, it's shown me another side of the internet that for some time had been on the periphery of my online awareness. Thomas Moynihan puts forth a literary work that expertly blends a plethora of research fields, fantastical concepts, and his own prowess for academics and spine-related puns. While I, an engineer with a communications minor, am unsuited to more seriously critique the merits of a work of this academic caliber, I have found a number of reviews to cover where I can't. I will leave links to all of these reviews, along with the MIT press page for Spinal Catastrophism and Thomas Moynihan's Twitter in the description, with any resources I find as note also located there. Thomas Moynihan suffers from scoliosis, a condition to which he dedicates the book, and which also shapes a large portion of how it came to be written. For a perspective from a fellow scoliosis haver, check out this review by Travis Chi-Wing Lau in Synapsis, an online health humanities journal. It's shorter, but I think it's worth a quick read. If your focus is more on the high-end concepts and you have the vocabulary and experience to process such things, check out this other review from Cosmos in History, the Journal of Natural and Social Philosophy, Volume 15, Number 1, 2019. You'll find a book review entitled Book Review Unveiling Thomas Moynihan's Spinal Catastrophism, the Spine Considered as a Chronogenetic Media Artifact. Ekin Arkin discusses some of the philosophical and psychological aspects of spinal catastrophism, breaking down Moynihan's Hegelianism, among other things, over the course of 8 pages. Lastly, and most curiously, after spending multiple years apart from the script and diving back into the research, I found this 2021 paper from the University of Waterloo where Anabaptist Mennonite scholar Maxwell Kennel cites Moynihan and spinal catastrophism in a discussion of developments in the Mennonite philosophy towards technology. It's more surreal than anything else. This paper exposed me to David Will's Dorsality, Thinking Back Through Technology and Politics, another book exploring spine/body as processes. It also discusses Adriana Cavarero's Inclinations, a Critique of Rectitude, which overlays the upright, inclined posture duality onto human ethics of mortality and natalism. How I never clocked these works during my initial research, I don't know. All of that said, thank you for sticking with me through the full runtime of this video. This was both mentally and physically taxing for me to do, and I hope you understand why I was so hesitant to jump back into part 2. Regardless, please do share this video around. I'd like to capture that initial audience that watched part 1 and let them know that they didn't quite get the full picture. That, and big numbers give me dopamine. Also, comment, "Mind has very well reached to the end of its bony tether," so I know that you finished the video. Once again, buy the book, back Manamania on Kickstarter, and follow the channel, or else your ANS will overthrow your neurological bourgeoisie. And as always, freak out. Okay, like one last thing. I regret to inform you, my parents found the last video. I know, shocker. This was the first time they'd seen literally anything from my channel, despite the fact that I have been earning checks from YouTube for multiple years now and have had to sort of go to them for tax advice on what to do with that. But thankfully, the words I had in the video were so confusing that they gave up a short while in. Perhaps all of that is for the best. This was just a fun little anecdote I thought I'd share with you all.